My name is Larry Kociolek. I'm the Vice President of System Preparedness, Prevention and Response at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, and I'm a pediatric infectious diseases physician and serve as an attending physician there at Lurie Children's in Chicago. Today's session is focused on pandemic preparedness. I currently serve as the site PI at Lurie Children's for the Pediatric Pandemic Network, or PPN. The PPN is a HRSA-funded network currently consisting of 10 hub children's hospitals. We are currently in year 2 of this bold and innovative venture. In collaboration with the nation's children's hospitals and their communities, the PPN coordinates, prepares, and enables high-quality, equitable, research-based pediatric care in emergencies, disasters, and pandemics. Our vision is to improve health outcomes of children and the resiliency of children, families, and communities impacted by emergencies, disasters, and pandemics. Well, my field of pediatric infectious diseases is certainly at the forefront of pandemic preparedness. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that pandemics impact children well beyond the clinical impact of the virus. The pandemic has opened the door for broad and extensive engagement of stakeholders across the pediatric healthcare and public health spectrum. At its core, the PPN is designed to foster this engagement and identify and implement a myriad of solutions in emergency preparedness, mental health, health equity, community engagement, healthcare capacity, and communication, among several others. Today's session will focus on those specific topics and feature several of our PPN leaders who have particular expertise in those areas. But first, before we start those talks, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Cinnamon Dixon, who will deliver our keynote presentation. Dr. Dixon is a medical officer within the Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness Branch of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Dixon currently leads the NICHD's Unintentional Injury Prevention and Trauma Care, Emergency Medical Services for Children, and Pediatric Disaster Science programs, as well as several other federal groups committed to advancing disaster research. Cinnamon, thanks for joining us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all, and thank you for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be here today, and I just have heard terrific information about yesterday's presentations, and I'm hoping that today's conversations and discussions foster a similar enthusiasm. So my thanks to Children's National and other stakeholders, both academic and community, who have helped put on this conference, as well as to my NIAID colleagues. Truly, it's a pleasure to be here. I like to always start with the notion that it is always a privilege and honor to speak on behalf of children's health and protection. And for this topic in particular, I find that it often hits home. And I don't think that's because that we as a globe faced a pandemic the last 3 years. I think it's because of the surmounting energy and distress that is around disasters, pandemics, and public health emergencies at large. Especially relevant is the fact that this will touch all of us beyond the last 3 years, as our children, our children's children, and future generations will, statistically speaking, all be affected by public health emergencies, pandemics, and disasters. I presume that all of us have felt over the last 3 years the great need to do more. And my hope from this conference is, as we talk about pediatric pandemics, public health emergencies, and disasters, we will all again feel that great need to do more and hopefully collaborate, coordinate, and have science help us. With that said, let's delve in to the great opportunities that exist to build capacity, coordination, and science across the continuum for the children's sake. I have no relevant disclosures. Starting off, I think a shared understanding of terminology is important. Perhaps this was already discussed at yesterday's sessions, and I know that most of you in the room are familiar with what a pandemic is at this point. However, the official definition is that it's an outbreak of disease that occurs over a wide geographic region and typically affects a significant population. Certainly with COVID, we all felt the pandemic, and it was widespread across nations, across continents. A public health emergency of international concern, which is also sometimes described as a fake, is different. It's an extraordinary event which is determined to constitute a public health risk to other states or countries through the international spread of disease and potentially will require a coordinated international response. This is the highest level of concern. It's presumed to be sudden and unexpected. And certainly with COVID, the notion of creating a declaration of a fake was important in hopes that we could hopes to decrease the likelihood of it becoming a pandemic. And though a fake is in existence currently, as well as COVID and the pandemic, and though 2023, our hope is that the fake will end, we'll still be living with the pandemic for some time. More simply, in US borders, a public health emergency is declared if it's determined that a disease or disorder presents a public health emergency, which can include outbreaks, infectious diseases, certainly in bioterrorist attacks and others. A disaster, on the other hand, is a serious disruption of a functioning of a community or society, causing widespread human, material, economic, and environmental losses that exceed the ability of the community or society to cope using its own resources. COVID was a disaster. A major disaster declaration in the US is any natural catastrophe, regardless of cause, flood, explosion, or fire in any part of the US, which the president determines has caused significant enough damage and magnitude to warrant major disaster assistance under the Stafford Act. With this terminology in mind, let's talk about the burden of pandemics, public health emergencies, and disasters, which is immense. Looking at the global data for disasters by hazard, we see that in 2022, there were 387 disasters across the globe. This was fairly consistent with the annual average that we'd seen for the preceding 2 decades at 370 disasters per year. These 2022 disasters included droughts, earthquakes, extreme temperatures, floods, landslides, storms, volcanic activity, and wildfire. And it affected 185 million individuals with over 30,000 lives lost and an estimated of $223 billion in economic damage. However, notably, these disasters don't include disasters that were human-induced, pandemics, public health emergencies, or humanitarian crises. Adding COVID to the global data changes everything. As was stated in this World Disasters Report in 2022, COVID is a disaster without recent parallels. If we compare the global health death toll from 2020 to 2022 alone to the most severe disasters in the 21st century, we see this enormous gravity of life lost. Well over 6.5 million deaths have been attributed to COVID-19 at the time of this report. And that's as compared to other, again, serious disasters such as the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, H1N1 in 2009, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and Cyclone Nargis in 2008, all of which individually had less than 300,000 lives lost. Additionally, the economic damage due to COVID at the time of this report was estimated to be $13.8 trillion. As was stated in this report, no disaster in recent decades has had such sweeping impacts, and yet we are all aware that not everyone suffered equally, and in many cases, the pandemic aggravated existing inequities. Clearly, the burden of disasters, as I've already shown, and COVID is impressive. But I just want to highlight, again, this data that I've demonstrated is not inclusive of human-caused factors, which entail global incidents such as fire, explosion, collision, shipwreck, structural collapse, pollution, war, economic crisis, and even mass violence. Let's put the burden in perspective to our US borders. There have been over 4,700 federal disaster declarations since 1953, as depicted in the left bar chart. Topping out at that time was in 2020, where we had 315 disasters. If we look across the incident types, the vast majority of these disasters fell into categories of fire, severe weather, and flood. But also I want to highlight another category, which includes human-made disasters, including, of course, landslides, infrastructure changes, earthquakes, human events, biologic events, and drought. From 1980 to 2022, the annual average of billion-dollar weather and climate events alone, if we think about the economic impact of disasters, was 8.1 per year. In comparison, the annual average for these events for the last 5 years is now 18 events per year. Clearly, this is affecting us on a grave scale. So why the children? Obviously, the burden across the US and the globe is immense, but why children? All of us in this room and probably listening online today have a great interest and passion for kids. But again, thinking about why and having a shared understanding of the importance of children is critical to when we start to think about how do we develop preparedness, response, and recovery activities. First, children have rights. In 1989, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child outlined the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Moreover, it made a historic commitment to the world's children, agreeing that children have fundamental rights to protection, education, healthcare, shelter, nutrition, and more. And obviously, these rights exist at everyday times and are important. But I would argue that in the case of pandemics, public health emergencies, and disasters, these rights are even more critical to protect. And that's because at these times, during these events, the risk to children are heightened, and then safeguards to their protection are more likely to fail. Second, it matters because children represent a significant and decreasing percentage of our population. In 2021, the global population of children was 25%. That's down from the 1960s, where we had peaks up in the high 30 percentile. Similarly, we've seen that percentage change in US borders, within 2021, the US population of kids representing 22% of our global population. So if we want to ensure equity in how we manage pandemics, public health emergencies, and disasters in our nation and across the globe, and if we want to ensure that we have a secure future, we must address children's needs during these events. Third, and something I know all of you are familiar with, is that children have inherent differences at baselines. Not to belabor the point, but they have different anatomy and physiology, different developmental capacities, communication preferences, social and emotional needs, and levels of dependency at every age and stage. I love this depiction of these kids, as we can all see differences between the toddler and the infant, the middle-aged child versus the younger age child, and even our young teens and our older teens. It is these inherent differences that make children most vulnerable during and after any disaster. With upwards of 30 to 50% of those who die in natural events being children, and not surprisingly, from conditions that would have otherwise caused morbidity in non-emergency situations. And hence why Disaster risk management approaches must take these vulnerabilities into consideration in their planning, responding, and recovery. So the continuum, how do we do better for kids across pandemics, public health, emergencies, and disasters? This continuum is probably familiar to a lot of you. It's the disaster management cycle. And certainly after the last 3 years, where this framework was often used as we thought about the pandemic, it became even more common to see. Where the cycle starts at preparedness, there's an incident in red, response occurs, recovery, prevention, and mitigation. And ultimately, in the ideal setting, all of that prepares us better the next time. Similarly, we see that the pandemic cycle, the pandemic phase, the pandemic cycle can be mapped onto the disaster management cycle, with the alert phase corresponding with the incident and response phase, the pandemic phase, transition phase, ultimately post-pandemic phase, and inter-pandemic phase also mapping on. But as we think about how to do better with this framework, we need to build capacity. Going the wrong way. We need to build capacity as well as coordination and science across all phases. Starting with capacity, which is defined as to fully occupy the space. At baseline, there is a woeful undercapacity for pandemics, public health emergencies, and disasters globally. Based on the 2021 Global Health Security Index, which measures security capacities of 195 countries across 6 pillars from prevention, detection, response, health, norms, and risk, all countries are dangerously underprepared, with a global average of about 40 out of 100. And concerningly, 4 of the 6 categories which are scoring the lowest are in the areas of prevention, detection and reporting, response, and health systems capacity building. Most concerningly also is that we have seen great decreases since 2019, highlighting a lack of progress, and most especially those gaps between vulnerable and non-vulnerable populations have slowed, decreased, or shown no change since 2019. I also like to highlight, as a pediatrician in the room, which I know many of you are, this report didn't bring up children. And as we all know, like we just discussed, they are certainly the most vulnerable population. The US, however, ranks first overall on this GHS Security Index. However, there's still room for improvement. We're 38th in laboratory system strength and quality, 19th in exercising response plans, 46th in risk communication, 183rd in healthcare access, 49th in socioeconomic resilience, and 23rd in public health vulnerabilities. Again, thinking about the vulnerabilities and no comments about children. But not all is bad news. We've actually had a significant amount of growth over the last decade in capacity for kids, starting with the Kids in Disasters Wellbeing Act in 2007, which established the National Commission on Children and Disasters, who ultimately put forward a report which many of you have probably read after having an extensive review of how good we are at preparing for, responding to, and recovering for disasters for children. I'd like to share an excerpt quickly with this report in mind to demonstrate where we were in 2010, but also where we are and where we have the potential to go with groups like the PPN. Children represent nearly 25% of our population. Consider that on any given weekday, 67 million kids are in schools and in childcare settings, a time when they're most vulnerable. Certainly, only a handful of states require basic school evacuation and family reunification plans. In addition, just 25% of EMS agencies and only 6% of hospital emergency departments are ready to take care of kids in an emergency. The Strategic National Stockpile is intended to provide the public with medicine and medical supplies in the event of a public health emergency. It is woefully understocked for medical countermeasures for children, and the fragile state of readiness deteriorates quickly when a disaster strikes. Programs and practices for managing disasters are fragmented and unaccountable to children. However, fast forward now a decade later, and we start to see a significant capacity momentum, starting in 2019 with funding of ASPR 2 pediatric disaster care centers of excellence, which is now 3, ASPR's Interagency Pediatric Surge Group, as well as another federal group working on disasters called the Subcommittee on Climate Emergencies and Disasters within the President's Task Force for Environmental Health Risks and Safety Risks to Children. Clearly, the HRSA Pediatric Pandemic Network, which you're going to hear a lot more about, the National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters, which is now reconvened, the Homeland Security Act for Children, which was signed by President Biden in June, and the National Academy's landmark Pediatric Disaster Science Symposium. So let's talk about coordination. As is the case with capacity and coordination, we need to have collaboration and integration. This definition hits home. Coordination is the organization of different elements of a complex body so as to enable them to work together effectively. Collaboration is absolutely critical when we think about disasters, public health emergencies, as well as pandemics. No one field of science, management, operations can hold this space in silo. As was demonstrated by Peak and al. In this graphic, all of these groups, and I would argue even others, are necessary when we start to think about collaboration and coordination. 2 areas particularly prime for the pediatric audience are medicine and education, which I'd like to delve into briefly. Children visit their medical home regularly. Over 90% of kids have had a well child check in the last 12 years, and approximately 94% have seen a doctor. However, our pediatric practices are unprepared for disasters, with 34% of practitioners having had a related disaster training course. Only 48% of offices have a written disaster plan, and only 55% maintaining emergency supplies. Also concerningly, solo and small practices are even less prepared. So if we want to do better for kids, we need to collaborate with the medical home and coordinate with them. And as was stated in an AP statement in 2015, because the majority of medical care is delivered in the outpatient practice settings, pediatricians from these settings must be included and engaged in disaster preparedness response efforts. Children also seek emergency care. About 30 million emergency department visits occur every year by children, and approximately 83% of these are happening in non-children's EDs, which are likely to have less readiness to care for a child. And yet we know that emergency care that happens in emergency departments where the readiness is high to care for children, that means the supplies, staffing, resources, improves children's outcomes in the event of an emergency. Unfortunately, however, readiness across our nation varies considerably, and we have to do better. And that's not just for everyday times, but if we can scale up our readiness in emergency departments in everyday times, it makes us potentially more safe and protected when we have crisis times. The quote here is from the JAMA Network article recently: because 30% of children live more than 30 minutes from high readiness emergency departments, the optimal solution is to promote policies and incentives to increase ED pediatric readiness among all US hospitals, including rural and frontier regions. And I would argue collaboration and coordination is critical in this space. From the vantage point of education, look, children have predictable localities. Over 53 million K through 12 students are enrolled every year. and over 50% of 3 to 4-year-olds are in formal preschools. Additionally, millions under age 3 are in daycare settings. It's not like we don't know where the kids are. Unfortunately, however, our schools are not prepared. Based on this K through 12 school review, it showed that there were no universal standards for school disaster plans or procedures across the US. And on multiple levels, these schools, K through 12, not even considering daycare settings or preschools, were underprepared. As noted, our nation's schools are not adequately prepared for disasters. There is a need for further research in schools to identify and understand preparedness for disasters, and schools partnering and working with collaboration with experts within the field of disaster preparedness can enhance all phases of disaster management. Finally, science, which is defined as the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, and testing of theories against the evidence obtained. I again love this graphic by Peak and al. Disaster science has to exemplify transdisciplinary and integrative approaches. From the left to the right, you can see unidisciplinary, and on the right-hand side, transdisciplinary, with increasing breadth and depth of knowledge and integration across the scale. Back to what I said, no one science can hold this field entirely in a silo, and hence we have to have transdisciplinary as well as integrative approaches. Leaning into this notion and recognizing that cleared opportunity to build the field of science pertaining to kids and disasters or public health emergencies or pandemics, the National Academies convened the landmark Pediatric Disaster Science Symposium last August, with the premise that we owe it to the youngest members of our communities to learn from each event, to fill our critical knowledge gaps, and to do so through ethically sound research during public health emergencies. Essentially, we have to do better. The symposium's purpose was to convene a broad representation, many in this room were here at that symposium, of both governmental, academic, community stakeholders, and subject matter experts. We scoped perspectives, experiences, information, and scientific needs related to disasters affecting all child populations. And again, looking across the continuum from preparedness to response to recovery, we talked about what are the areas of pediatric disaster science that need to be highlighted? How do we build alignment and synergy of the scientific efforts? And ultimately, how do we consider the capacity building around evidence-based practices and scientific discovery? The take-homes from this symposium was that science and evidence has to incorporate all phases of the disaster management cycle, from preparedness, response, recovery, and ultimately mitigation and prevention. I would like to share just a few other highlights that was taken home after this symposium. First, there is immense opportunity to grow and increase our rigor in science in this field. There are broad scientific methodologies that can be used to build the evidence. This is from basic sciences to surveillance, to clinical effectiveness, to D&I, community engaged research, applied sciences, and system sciences. The potential to scale scientific protocols and instruments for kids is immense. We also have to engage our communities and leverage our networks that are in existence, as well as centers and infrastructure. Disaster science has the capacity to harness data as well as to set the norm of what accelerated data sharing is and can be for the future and future fields. Critical always when we talk about children and science or research is to ensure ethical guardrails around rapid review and human subjects protection. Clearly, there's a big need to build this scientific workforce that's diverse and can be integrated and work together in an equitable way. And finally, sustainable funding streams and evidence-based policies are necessary to move this work forward. My final take-home points, that the burden of these events on all populations is immense. Children are one of the most vulnerable populations in these events, whether, again, pandemics, public health emergencies, or disasters. Safeguarding kids before, during, and after a potential event and fostering their protection and resilience is critical. Capacity to scale efforts equitably to address these events is our only option, and coordination in the form of transdisciplinary collaboration and integration of activities exemplifies our best approach. And finally, pediatric disaster science is essential to build the evidence and ensure that preparedness programs, response interventions, and recovery activities are most suitable, equitable, and effective for child populations. And as I've shared before, I'll just say finally, in short order, we'll all go home. We'll probably take planes, trains, and automobiles home. Also, the people watching online will shut down their computer or transition to another task. But the problem of how we do better for kids in pandemics, public health emergencies, and disasters will still remain. The young boy who lost his mom to COVID will have to go on without a mother. The teenager who lost her home in a wildfire one day after Christmas will have to start the new year homeless. And the father who drops off his baby girl at school may never get a goodbye hug. Ultimately, like I said, the problem will still remain. That is unless all of us as a collective group of passionate, skilled, knowledgeable, and diverse experts work together collaboratively in a coordinated and integrated fashion with a scientific mind to do better for kids. And as I've said before, one last thing, we do hard things, right? We've been sending men into space or humans into space for 6 decades. We've mapped the human genome 20 years ago. We can do this if we work together for the children's sake. Thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations today.
Thanks so much for the outstanding talk. Really give a compelling argument about the purpose of our work and how much work we still have left to do. I was really struck by the data about the pervasiveness of both disasters and underpreparedness, and the really concerning inequities in the response efforts, not only geographically across the world in the United States, but across different healthcare settings, and of course, the inclusion of children. And the data showing how disasters are increasing in frequency really struck me as well. We clearly have an epidemic of epidemics that need real solutions and progress. And serendipitously, we actually have a lot of people here today that have a lot of great ideas about what those solutions are and how we move forward and address the problems that Dr. Dixon had presented.